September 12, 1942. Mid-Atlantic, 700 miles west of Cape Verde. The periscope of U-156 cut through dark water like a knife through silk, leaving barely a ripple in the pre-dawn stillness. Below, in the cramped control room that smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and recycled air, Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein gripped the handles of the attack periscope and watched his target take shape against the gray horizon. She was massive. Over 600 feet long, displacing nearly 20,000 tons. The RMS Laconia, a British troopship, steaming unescorted through waters that belonged to the hunters. Through the crosshairs, Hartenstein could make out details. The faint glow from portholes that should have been darkened. The silhouette of the bridge against the lightning sky. The smooth, almost leisurely progress of a ship whose captain believed himself safe. Hartenstein was 35 years old. He had been hunting Allied shipping since 1940, commanded U-156 for over a year, and sent 19 ships to the bottom. He was a professional submarine commander, not a young hothead fresh from training. The Iron Cross First Class on his uniform was earned through competence, not recklessness. He understood that war had rules, even in this twilight realm beneath the waves where death came silently and without warning. Around him, his crew moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this dozens of times. The torpedo room crew had loaded tubes 1 through 4. The engineer monitored depth and trim. The radio operator listened for enemy transmissions. Everything was ready. Everything was routine. But nothing about the next 48 hours would be routine. The decision Hartenstein would make after firing those torpedoes would haunt him for the rest of his life, define him more than any military victory, and pose questions about duty, humanity, and the moral cost of war that had no simple answers. The Laconia was carrying British military personnel. She was a legitimate target under the rules of warfare. Hartenstein had every right to attack. He gave the order calmly, as he had given it before. Fire tubes 1 and 2. The torpedoes left the submarine with a rush of compressed air and a shudder that ran through the hull. In the control room, men counted seconds. The range was 2,000 meters. The running time would be approximately 90 seconds. They waited in that peculiar silence that comes after launching torpedoes, when there is nothing to do but count and hope and wait for the explosion that will tell you whether your calculations were correct. The first torpedo struck the Laconia amidships at 8:10 p.m. The second hit aft, below the waterline, tearing open the engine room and flooding it within minutes. Through the periscope, Hartenstein watched the ship list immediately to starboard. Steam erupted from her funnels. Even from this distance, he could hear the alarm bells. Standard procedure now was simple. Remain at periscope depth, observe the sinking to confirm the kill, and then slip away before Allied aircraft or warships could respond to the distress signal. Hartenstein had done this before. You fired, you watched, you left. You did not think too much about the men in the water. They were enemy combatants. This was war. But something made him keep watching. Perhaps it was the sheer size of the Laconia. Perhaps it was the speed with which she was settling. Perhaps it was the time of day, with dawn breaking and the sea calm and the dying ship so clearly visible. He watched as lifeboats began to launch, some orderly, others lowering so fast they capsized and spilled their human cargo into the water. Then he heard something that changed everything. It started as a faint sound through the hydrophones, barely distinguishable from the groaning of the sinking ship and the rush of water. But as the radio operator adjusted the frequencies, it became clear. Screaming. Not the shouts of sailors abandoning ship, but something different. Higher pitched. Desperate. Women. Children. The radio operator looked up from his station, his face pale in the dim red light of the control room. Hartenstein felt something cold move through his chest. The Laconia was a troopship. Military personnel only. That was the intelligence. That was why she was a legitimate target. He ordered the boat to surface. It was a dangerous decision. Dawn was breaking. Allied patrol aircraft could appear at any moment. But he had to see. He had to know what he had done. U-156 broke the surface 500 meters from the sinking ship. Hartenstein climbed the conning tower and raised his binoculars. What he saw through those lenses would replay in his mind's eye for the rest of his life, appearing in dreams and quiet moments, unchanging and unavoidable. The Laconia was going down by the stern, her bow rising slowly into the air. Lifeboats dotted the water around her, some capsized, others dangerously overcrowded. And everywhere, in the water, clinging to debris, calling for help, were hundreds of people. Not just sailors. Not just soldiers. Women in dresses. Small children being held above water by exhausted adults. Elderly people floating in life jackets, too weak to swim. Italian prisoners of war. British military families. Polish refugees. Over 1,800 Italian POWs being transported to prisoner camps. Hundreds of British service personnel and their dependents. All of them now in the water, watching their ship die, calling for rescue that might never come. Hartenstein lowered his binoculars. His hands, always steady during combat, were shaking. The Iron Cross on his chest, earned through successful attacks on enemy shipping, suddenly felt heavy. He turned to his first watch officer. "Get on the radio," he said quietly. "Send a message in clear. To any ship, any nationality. We need help here." The sun rose over a scene that belonged in a painting of hell, not the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. U-156 sat on the surface among hundreds of survivors, her deck crowded with people pulled from the water, her radio transmitting a message that violated every principle of submarine warfare. Asterisk to all ships. This is German U-boat. Sinking ship with women and children aboard. Require immediate assistance. Will not attack rescue vessels. AM remaining on surface to assist. Position, asterisk. In the control room, Hartenstein's officers stared at him with expressions ranging from admiration to concern to outright fear. What their captain was doing was unprecedented. He was revealing his position to the enemy. He was remaining on the surface in hostile waters. He was using his submarine, a weapon of war, as a rescue vessel. Lieutenant Werner Laubenthal, the first watch officer, spoke carefully. "Herr Kalu, if Allied aircraft or warships respond to this transmission, we will be helpless. The boat is overcrowded. We cannot dive quickly. We cannot fight. We're defenseless." Hartenstein knew this. He had spent years learning submarine tactics, understanding that a U-boat's survival depended on stealth, on diving quickly when threatened, on never remaining on the surface longer than absolutely necessary. Every moment U-156 stayed on the surface was a moment when she could be destroyed by depth charges, bombs, or gunfire. But he also knew what he was seeing. Women holding babies. Children too young to understand what was happening. Men injured in the torpedo strikes, bleeding into the water. The elderly, the weak, the defenseless. "Continue rescue operations," he ordered. "And keep transmitting that message. Someone will respond." The crew went to work. Submariners, trained to attack ships without warning, now pulled survivors from the water with the same efficiency they brought to war. They formed human chains, passing exhausted people up onto the narrow deck. They gave up their bunks, their food, their water. The submarine's doctor, designed to treat a crew of 50, now tried to care for hundreds. The deck of U-156 became a bizarre tableau of enemies working together. German sailors helped British officers aboard. Italian POWs, weak from weeks in the Laconia's hold, found themselves being given water by the same men who had torpedoed their ship. Children sat on the submarine's deck guns, too shocked to cry. One woman, probably in her 30s, was pulled aboard with a baby clutched to her chest. She was shaking so badly she could barely stand. A German sailor, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, took off his own jacket and wrapped it around her. She looked at him with an expression Hartenstein would remember. Not gratitude exactly. Not relief. Something more like confusion at finding humanity where she had expected only death. By noon, U-156 had rescued 200 people. They covered the deck, filled the conning tower, packed into every available space. The submarine sat dangerously low in the water, her stability compromised by the weight of so many bodies. Below, in the torpedo room, the control room, the engine room, crew members squeezed past survivors to reach their stations. But there were still hundreds in the water. Hartenstein radioed again, this time sending a message that would reach not just Allied ships but German high command. He was requesting that Admiral Donitz, commander of all U-boat operations, authorize other submarines in the area to assist in rescue operations. The response from Donitz was clear and immediate. Assist if possible, but the safety of German crews and vessels took priority. Do not compromise the boat. Do not remain on surface in daylight. If attacked, you are authorized to dive immediately and abandon survivors. It was the response Hartenstein expected. It was also the response he had already decided to ignore. 3 other U-boats received orders to proceed to the scene. U-506, under Kapitänleutnant Erich Werdmann, U-507 under Korvettenkapitän Harro Schacht, and the Italian submarine Kapitänleutnant. They would arrive in approximately 24 hours. Until then, U-156 would remain on station, continue rescue operations, and hope that Allied forces did not arrive first. Night fell. The Atlantic was calm, almost gentle, as if the ocean itself was embarrassed by the carnage it had hosted. Survivors who could not fit on the submarine crowded into lifeboats that U-156 towed behind her. The German crew rigged lights so people could see, despite the risk of being spotted by aircraft. They distributed food and water, medical supplies, blankets. In the water, British officers organized survivors, maintained discipline, tried to keep people from panicking. Some of them recognized the absurdity of the situation. They were being rescued by the submarine that had torpedoed them. They were being protected by the enemy. But they were alive, and their children were alive, and nothing else seemed to matter very much. Hartenstein spent the night on the bridge, refusing to sleep. He watched the horizon for lights that might be rescue ships. He watched the sky for aircraft that might be bombers. And he watched the people crowded on his deck, wondering what he had condemned his crew to in order to save them. One of the British officers was brought up to the bridge. Commander John Dixon, Royal Navy, senior surviving officer from the Laconia. He stood beside Hartenstein in the darkness, 2 professional naval officers whose duty had put them on opposite sides of the war. "Why are you doing this?" Dixon asked quietly. "You could dive and be gone. You could be safe. Instead you're risking your boat, your crew. Why?" Hartenstein was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that would be reported in Dixon's official statement after the war. "Because when I fired those torpedoes, I did not know who I was killing. Now I know. And I cannot leave them to die simply because my government calls them enemies." Dixon nodded slowly. "If an Allied aircraft comes, you'll have to dive." "I know. And if you dive, most of these people will die. We don't have enough boats. The water is too cold. They'll last maybe 12 hours. I know that too. So what's your plan, Captain?" Hartenstein looked at the British commander. "I don't have one," he admitted. "I'm hoping that tomorrow, someone comes. Someone with ships that can take these people. Until then, we wait." The 2 officers stood in silence, watching the survivors. Enemies by definition of war, bound together by what Hartenstein had done and what both of them hoped would happen before dawn. But hope, as both men knew from experience, was not a plan. And the Atlantic Ocean, whatever its mood tonight, did not take sides. It simply waited, patient as always, to see what humans would do to each other next. September 16, 1942. 3rd day of rescue operations. U-156 sat on the surface, still surrounded by lifeboats, still towing survivors, still transmitting its position to any ship that would listen. The other German submarines had arrived. U-506 and U-507 now shared the work of rescue, each towing lifeboats filled with survivors, each waiting for the Allied ships that Hartenstein had been promised would come. The French ships were coming. Vichy French warships, technically neutral but sympathetic to the German cause, had been contacted through diplomatic channels. They were steaming toward the scene with the capacity to take all survivors aboard. Arrival time, approximately 8 hours. For 3 days, nothing had gone wrong. No Allied aircraft had appeared. No warships had stumbled upon the strange scene of German submarines serving as rescue vessels. It seemed almost as if the war had taken a pause, as if both sides had agreed to stop killing long enough to save these particular lives. Hartenstein allowed himself to think they might actually succeed. The survivors would be rescued. His crew would survive. The decision to stay and help would be vindicated. It would be a story of humanity triumphing over war, proof that even in the darkest conflicts, men could choose mercy. Then, at 11:25 a.m., a lookout shouted a warning that destroyed everything. Aircraft. B-24 Liberator. American. Approaching from the east. Hartenstein's blood went cold. He raised his binoculars and saw it clearly. 4 engines. Heavy bomber. Flying low. The aircraft was definitely close enough to see them. To see the submarine on the surface. To see the lifeboats being towed. To see everything. He grabbed the signal lamp and began flashing in Morse code. Do not attack. Rescuing survivors. Women and children aboard. He ordered a large Red Cross flag unfurled on the deck. He ordered survivors to wave white cloths, anything to signal that this was a rescue operation, not a military target. The B-24 circled once. Hartenstein watched it through the binoculars, trying to will the pilot to see what was happening, to understand. The aircraft was low enough that he could see details. The gun turrets. The bomb bay doors. The markings on the fuselage. For one moment, he thought the pilot understood. The aircraft leveled off, seemed to be turning away. Hartenstein exhaled, his chest tight with relief he hadn't realized he was feeling. Then the B-24 turned back. Bomb bay doors opened. And the Liberator began its attack run. Clear the deck. Hartenstein screamed the order even as he was running for the conning tower hatch. Dive. Dive. Emergency dive. The crew moved with trained precision, but they were slowed by the survivors on deck. German sailors physically threw people into the water, not out of cruelty but because there was no time for anything else. The British officers who had been helping maintain order grabbed children and jumped. The first depth charge fell 50 meters from U-156 and exploded with a massive underwater detonation that shook the submarine like a dog shaking a rat. The second fell closer. The third was almost a direct hit, exploding so close that lights shattered in the control room and men were thrown off their feet. Hartenstein held onto the periscope housing as the submarine fought to dive. She was still too heavy, still sluggish from the survivors who had packed her deck. The engineer was screaming depth readings, but they weren't diving fast enough. Another depth charge. Another violent shudder. Through the hull, Hartenstein could hear other sounds. Screaming. People in the water who had been pulled aboard U-156, saved from drowning 3 days ago, now being dumped back into the ocean. The lifeboats being cut loose, their tow cables severed by fragments from the depth charges. The periscope view showed a nightmare scene. The B-24 making another pass. People in the water, thrashing, some injured from the explosions, others simply trying to stay afloat. Lifeboats capsizing from the shock waves. One of them had taken a direct hit and disintegrated, bodies floating in the debris. And through it all, the Red Cross flag that Hartenstein had hoped would protect them, floating on the surface, torn and useless. U-156 reached 70 meters, then 80, then 100. Below the thermocline now, below where the B-24 could reach with depth charges. They held there in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of more explosions above. The American aircraft was still attacking. Still dropping bombs on the survivors that U-156 had spent 3 days trying to save. In the control room, men were bleeding from wounds caused by flying equipment. The engineer reported damage to the diving planes, damage to the ballast system. Nothing fatal, but enough that U-156 would need to limp home rather than continue operations. The doctor moved among the injured, working by emergency lighting, using supplies that had already been depleted caring for survivors. Hartenstein stood at the periscope, though he couldn't see anything at this depth. His hands gripped the handles so tightly his knuckles were white. He was trying not to think about what was happening above them. Trying not to imagine the people who had been on his deck, the children who had been saved, now back in the water, injured, dying. Lieutenant Laubenthal approached carefully. Herr Kalu, we need to stay down. Wait for the aircraft to leave. The boat is damaged. If we surface now and he attacks again. I know. Hartenstein's voice was flat, emotionless. The voice of a man forcing himself not to feel. Maintain this depth. Silent running. 2 hours. They stayed down for 2 hours. Long enough for the American bomber to depart. Long enough for the Vichy French ships to arrive. Long enough for Hartenstein to understand exactly what he had done. When U-156 finally surfaced, the scene had changed. The French warships were there, picking up survivors. The other submarines had also surfaced and were assisting. But the numbers were devastating. Of the 200 people who had been on U-156's deck, perhaps 60 had survived being dumped into the water and the subsequent bombing. The rest were dead or missing. One of the lifeboats floated nearby, half submerged. In it were 3 children, all dead, their small bodies battered by the explosions. A German sailor on deck saw them and vomited over the side. Another turned away, his shoulders shaking. Hartenstein stood on the bridge and watched the French ships work. They would save most of the remaining survivors. Perhaps 1,000 of the original 2,700 people on the Laconia would live. But 200 of those who would die had been on his submarine, under his protection, when the American bomber attacked. 200 people who would have been alive if he had simply followed orders, fired his torpedoes, and left. Commander Dixon, the British officer, had survived. He was in one of the lifeboats being picked up by a French destroyer. As the boat passed near U-156, he looked up at Hartenstein. Their eyes met. Dixon raised one hand in a slow salute. Not mocking. Not grateful. Just acknowledging. What that salute meant, Hartenstein couldn't say. Perhaps it was thanks for trying. Perhaps it was understanding that Hartenstein had done what he could. Perhaps it was simply one officer recognizing another's impossible position. Or perhaps it was something darker. Recognition that doing the right thing had led to more death than doing the wrong thing would have caused. That mercy had accomplished what naval efficiency would not have. That Hartenstein's decision to stay and rescue survivors had, in the end, killed more people than it saved. U-156 slipped beneath the waves and began the long journey back to France. Behind her, the Vichy ships completed their rescue operations. The B-24 that had attacked returned to its base and filed a report claiming to have damaged or sunk a German submarine engaged in offensive operations. And somewhere in the Atlantic, carried on currents that had no interest in human wars or human mercy, the bodies of those who drowned floated in the darkness. Some of them had died when the Laconia was torpedoed. Others had died when they were thrown into the water as U-156 Dove. Others had died when the American bombs fell. All of them were dead, regardless of whose decision had killed them. And Werner Hartenstein would spend the rest of his life trying to understand which deaths were his responsibility. U-156 returned to its base at Lorient, France, on October 3, 1942. The submarine was damaged but operational. The crew was exhausted but alive. And Werner Hartenstein was about to discover that his decision to rescue survivors would have consequences far beyond the 200 people who died during the American attack. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, summoned Hartenstein to his headquarters immediately upon arrival. The admiral was not pleased. In his office, Donitz paced while Hartenstein stood at attention. The admiral was not a cruel man. He understood submarine warfare as well as anyone alive, understood the moral complexities that commanders faced when targeting civilian ships and merchant vessels. But he also understood operational reality. You revealed your position to the enemy, Donitz said, his voice controlled but hard. You remained on the surface in hostile waters for 3 days. You compromised your vessel, endangered your crew, and achieved what, Hartenstein? Exactly what did you achieve? I saved over 1,000 people, Her Admiral. You got 200 people killed when that American bomber attacked. People who would be alive if you had simply submerged and withdrawn as standing orders require. The words hit Hartenstein like physical blows. He had been thinking the same thing for 2 weeks. Every night when he closed his eyes, he saw those children in the lifeboat. Every time he gave an order, he wondered if his judgment could be trusted. I made a decision, Hartenstein said quietly. I stand by that decision. Donitz stopped pacing and looked at Hartenstein for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost regretful. And I believe you made that decision for the right reasons. I believe you acted according to your conscience and your understanding of naval tradition. But Hartenstein, we are losing this war. Every submarine we lose brings us closer to defeat. I cannot allow commanders to risk their vessels for enemy survivors, no matter how tragic their circumstances. The Laconia order was issued on September 17, 1942, 5 days after the American attack on the rescue operation. It was transmitted to all U-boats at sea. The order was clear and unambiguous. U-boats were forbidden from attempting to rescue survivors of ships they had sunk. Commanders were specifically prohibited from remaining on surface to assist enemy personnel, even women and children, even under humanitarian circumstances. The order went further. It specified that German submarine commanders should make no effort to collect survivors onto lifeboats, provide no food or water, offer no assistance of any kind. The operational reality was simple. Survivors could report the submarine's position, attracting Allied aircraft and warships. Remaining on surface to help them was an operational risk that Germany could not afford. The Laconia order transformed submarine warfare. Before the order, many U-boat commanders had attempted to assist survivors when circumstances allowed, providing water, food, sometimes even directions to land. After the order, such gestures disappeared. Submarines fired torpedoes and withdrew. If people drowned, that was unfortunate but irrelevant to operational objectives. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, prosecutors cited the Laconia order as evidence of German naval war crimes. They argued that prohibiting rescue attempts was inhumane, violated the traditional laws of naval warfare, and constituted a war crime. Dönitz defended the order by pointing out that British and American submarines followed similar policies. He also introduced evidence of Allied attacks on German rescue operations, including the attack on U-156. The charges were ultimately dropped. The tribunal concluded that all sides in the submarine war had adopted similar policies, that operational realities made rescue attempts impractical, and that the Laconia order, while harsh, was not technically a violation of international law as understood at the time. But the legal verdict was irrelevant to Werner Hartenstein. He knew what the order meant. It meant that his decision to rescue Laconia survivors had changed German naval policy. It meant that survivors of future sinkings would not be helped, would not be given water, would not be pulled from the ocean by the men who had torpedoed their ships. It meant that his moment of mercy had led to an order that would condemn thousands to death. The crew of U-156 were quietly reassigned. Some were distributed to other submarines. Others were posted to shore duty. The official reason was operational efficiency, but everyone understood the real message. Dönitz was breaking up a crew that had demonstrated they might put humanitarian concerns above operational security. Hartenstein returned to sea in command of U-156 in March 1943. The Mediterranean, not the Atlantic. His new orders were specific. Sink Allied shipping supporting the invasion of North Africa. Report positions. Do not remain on surface longer than necessary. Do not attempt rescue operations. He followed his orders. Between March and July 1943, U-156 sank several Allied vessels. Hartenstein filed detailed reports. He attacked competently. He did not try to rescue survivors. He did exactly what was required of a U-boat commander in 1943. But something had changed. His crew noticed it. The easy confidence was gone. The quiet humor that had made him popular with his men had disappeared. He gave orders precisely, professionally, without emotion. He remained in the control room during attacks, watching through the periscope, but he no longer stood on the bridge afterwards to observe the sinking ship. Lieutenant Laubenthal, still serving as first watch officer, later described Hartenstein during this period as a man fulfilling a duty he no longer believed in. The attacks were executed flawlessly, but there was no satisfaction in them. Just the mechanical process of finding targets, firing torpedoes, confirming kills, moving to the next patrol area. On March 8, 1943, U-156 received orders to transit from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic through the Straits of Gibraltar. It was a dangerous passage. The strait was heavily patrolled by Allied aircraft and warships. U-boats attempting the transit were frequently lost. U-156 never made it through. The submarine was detected by British patrol aircraft east of Barbados. 2 Allied destroyers were vectored to the area. They made repeated depth charge attacks through the night of March 8. The submarine tried to escape. Hartenstein maneuvered brilliantly, using every tactic he had learned in 3 years of war. But the destroyers had improved sonar. They had more depth charges. They had more experience. U-156 was bracketed by explosions, pushed deeper, damaged, unable to surface or escape. At some point during that final attack, Hartenstein must have known they were finished. The boat was taking water. The batteries were failing. The hull was cracking under the pressure. In the control room, with water rising and the lights flickering and the sound of depth charges getting closer, he must have understood what was coming. No one knows what his final thoughts were. Whether he thought about his crew, who were about to die because of his orders to attempt the transit. Whether he thought about his family in Germany, who would receive a telegram informing them that he had been lost at sea. Whether he thought about those children in the lifeboat after the American bomber attacked. Or whether, at the end, he thought about Commander Dixon's salute, and wondered if dying this way, drowned in a steel tube at the bottom of the ocean, was somehow appropriate for a man who had condemned 200 people to death while trying to save them. U-156 was declared lost with all hands on March 8, 1943. Werner Hartenstein was 36 years old. His crew of 52 men died with him. None of their bodies were ever recovered. The Laconia incident created ripples that spread far beyond the immediate tragedy. In the years following the war, historians, military analysts, and ethicists examined the event from every angle, trying to understand what it meant about warfare, morality, and the impossible choices that combat forces upon individuals. The American pilot who attacked U-156 never knew what he had done. Lieutenant James D. Harden filed a standard mission report claiming to have attacked a German submarine engaged in offensive operations. He noted the presence of numerous small boats in the area but assumed they were German landing craft or support vessels. No one informed him that he had bombed a rescue operation. He received no commendation and no punishment. Years after the war, when researchers tried to locate him to discuss the incident, they discovered he had died in 1959, apparently never knowing the full truth of what occurred that day. Harden's commander, who authorized the attack, later testified that standing orders were clear. German submarines on the surface were to be attacked regardless of circumstances. The presence of survivors or rescue operations was not considered relevant to tactical decisions. The objective was to sink U-boats, not to evaluate the humanitarian nature of their current activities. This position was not unique to the Americans. British, Canadian, and other Allied naval commands maintained similar policies. Submarines were weapons, not rescue vessels. Allowing them to operate under Red Cross protection during rescue operations created a tactical loophole that could be exploited. Therefore, no exceptions. Any submarine on the surface was a valid target, regardless of what it appeared to be doing. From a purely military standpoint, the policy made sense. Submarines represented a critical threat to Allied shipping. Every U-boat sunk was one less that could attack convoys, one less that could strangle Britain's supply lines. Allowing submarines to remain on the surface unmolested simply because they were engaged in rescue would have created opportunities for German commanders to avoid destruction. But the policy also meant that humanitarian gestures in submarine warfare became operationally impossible. A commander like Hartenstein who attempted rescue was putting his vessel and crew at mortal risk not just from Allied warships but from his own actions. By surfacing to help, he made himself defenseless against aircraft attack. By taking survivors aboard, he slowed his submarine and made diving dangerous. The Laconia incident proved that mercy in submarine warfare was a luxury that neither side could afford. The survivors of the Laconia faced complex emotional journeys. Many owed their lives to Hartenstein's decision to surface and rescue them. Without his intervention, hundreds more would have died in the water waiting for rescue ships that might not have arrived in time. But they also knew that some of those who survived being torpedoed died when they were thrown into the water so U-156 could dive from the American bomber. Commander John Dixon, the British officer who saluted Hartenstein, returned to England and wrote a detailed report about the rescue operation. His report was classified for years, but portions were eventually released. In them, Dixon described Hartenstein as a man caught between duty to his nation and duty to common humanity, who chose humanity and paid the price for that choice. Dixon argued in his report that no blame should attach to Hartenstein for the deaths during the American attack. The German commander had transmitted his position and purpose in clear language. He had displayed Red Cross flags. He had done everything possible to signal that a rescue operation was underway. The attack, Dixon concluded, was a tragedy of war but not a crime, and the responsibility lay with standing military policies, not with individual commanders on either side. Some of the Italian POWs who survived the incident later wrote about their experience. Many noted the strange reversal of fortune. They had been captured fighting against Britain. They had been imprisoned, transported against their will. Then they had been torpedoed by Germany, their ally. And finally, they had been rescued by a German submarine commander who risked his vessel to save them. One Italian survivor, Carlo Rossi, wrote in his memoir that, "The submarine captain who saved us showed more concern for our lives than our own government did, or the British who held us prisoner, or the Germans who were supposed to be our allies." In that moment, nationality meant nothing. We were just people who needed help, and he was a person who could provide it. The French sailors who completed the rescue after U-156 Dove were also caught in the complexity of the situation. Vichy France was technically neutral but sympathetic to Germany. The crews of the French warships had been promised they would be allowed to conduct a humanitarian rescue without interference from either side. But they arrived to find a rescue operation that had been attacked by Allied aircraft, with bodies in the water and German submarines fleeing. Some of the French sailors later reported feeling betrayed by both sides. They had been sent to rescue women and children and had arrived to find a war zone. They completed their mission, bringing survivors to ports in French West Africa, but the experience left many of them questioning the nature of the conflict they were peripherally involved in. The German Navy's reaction to the incident was complex. Publicly, they praised Hartenstein for his seamanship and his humanitarian actions. The propaganda value of a German submarine commander risking his vessel to rescue British women and children was obvious. Stories were released emphasizing German honor and the humanity of U-boat crews. But internally, the Navy was deeply divided. Some officers, particularly older commanders trained in the pre-war naval tradition, supported Hartenstein's actions. Naval warfare had always included provisions for protecting those not engaged in combat. Women, children, civilian passengers on attacked vessels had traditionally been given assistance when possible. Other officers, particularly younger men who had grown up under Nazi ideology, viewed Hartenstein's actions as weakness. The enemy was the enemy. Mercy prolonged the war. Operational security was more important than humanitarian gestures. U-156 had been put at risk, had been damaged, and had ultimately been lost because Hartenstein had violated basic tactical principles. Admiral Donitz stood between these positions. He understood naval tradition. He also understood operational reality. The Laconia order represented his compromise, a formal policy that ended the debate by simply prohibiting rescue attempts. It protected commanders like Hartenstein from having to make impossible choices by making the choice for them. After the war, when the Laconia incident was discussed at the Nuremberg trials, the complexity of the situation became apparent even to prosecutors. They had intended to use the Laconia order as evidence of German war crimes. But the more they examined the incident, the more they realized that the order was a response to Allied actions, not a pre-planned atrocity. The American attack on U-156 during the rescue operation had effectively destroyed any possibility of humane submarine warfare. If attempting rescue made you a target, then rational commanders would not attempt rescue. The Laconia order simply formalized what operational reality had already made inevitable. In the end, no one was prosecuted for the Laconia incident. Not Hartenstein, who initiated the rescue. Not Harden, who attacked it. Not Donitz, who issued the order prohibiting future rescues. The tribunal concluded that the incident was a tragedy but not a crime, an example of how war forces impossible choices on decent people. Werner Hartenstein's family received notification of his death in April 1943. The telegram was brief. Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein lost at sea in action against enemy forces. Details classified. Accept the thanks of the German nation for his sacrifice. His mother kept that telegram for the rest of her life. She never learned the full details of what her son had done in September 1942. She knew only that he had died in combat, doing his duty, serving his country. Whether she would have been proud of his decision to rescue survivors, or horrified that it led to his death, no one can say. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy of the Laconia incident came not from official reports or tribunal proceedings but from something that happened years after the war. In 1967, a British naval officer attending a conference in Germany met a former U-boat commander who had served with Hartenstein. Over drinks, they discussed the war, as old soldiers do. The German officer mentioned the Laconia incident. The British officer fell silent. Then he revealed that his father had been one of the British soldiers aboard the Laconia, had been rescued by U-156, and had survived the American attack to be eventually picked up by the French warships. "Your Commander Hartenstein saved my father's life," the British officer said. "I exist because of what he did that day. But I also know that some of his crew died. That he died, 2 years later. I've always wondered if he thought it was worth it. Dying because he stayed to help people who were technically his enemies." The German officer thought for a moment. Then he said something that would be recorded in the British officer's memoir. "If you must die in war, is it not better to die trying to save people rather than trying to kill them?" Hartenstein could have lived longer if he had simply followed orders. But he would have been a different man. Perhaps that is the real cost of war, not the deaths, but what we become to survive. If Werner Hartenstein had survived the war, what would he have told his children when they asked what he did during the conflict? How would he have explained the Laconia incident to grandchildren born into a world where the moral certainties of wartime had given way to more complex questions about duty, honor, and the cost of human decency? We know from the testimony of his crew members who survived the war that the Laconia incident changed Hartenstein. The confident, almost cocky submarine commander who had sunk 19 ships without apparent moral qualms became something different after September 1942. Quieter. More introspective. Less certain. Lieutenant Laubenthal, in a deposition given for historical research in 1974, described the change. Before the Laconia, the Kalu was always sure of himself. He made decisions quickly, never second-guessed. After the rescue, after the American attack, he was different. He still gave orders properly. He still performed his duties. But there was something missing. A spark, maybe. Confidence. Or perhaps certainty that what we were doing mattered. Other crew members reported similar observations. Hartenstein began spending more time alone in his cabin. He stopped participating in the informal gatherings where officers would relax, play cards, tell stories. When he did speak with his men, the conversations were professional, operational. The personal warmth that had made him a popular commander faded. One petty officer recalled a conversation in the submarine's tiny wardroom, late at night during a patrol in early 1943. Hartenstein had come in to check some charts and found the petty officer unable to sleep, sitting alone. They had talked briefly about nothing in particular. Then the petty officer had asked, innocently, whether the captain thought they would survive the war. Hartenstein had been silent for a long time. Then he said something the petty officer never forgot. "Some of us will survive. Some won't. But the real question isn't whether our bodies survive. It's whether anything of who we were before the war will still exist when it's over. Whether we'll be able to look at ourselves without shame." The petty officer hadn't understood at the time. Only years later, after learning the full details of the Laconia incident, did those words make sense. Hartenstein's decision to rescue survivors was praised by his superiors. He received no punishment, no reprimand. But the outcome, the deaths during the American attack, the damage to his submarine, the creation of the Laconia order, these things were not praiseworthy. They were costs. Consequences. The price of choosing humanity in an inhumane situation. And the fundamental question that must have haunted Hartenstein in his final months was this: had his decision been right? If we judge solely by outcomes, the answer is unclear. Yes, over 1,000 people were rescued from the Laconia. But 200 of those people died during the American attack, and they died specifically because Hartenstein kept them on his submarine instead of leaving them in their lifeboats. If he had simply followed protocol, fire torpedoes, observe, leave, those 200 would have been in the water when the French rescue ships arrived, would likely have survived. Furthermore, the Laconia order that resulted from the incident meant that thousands of survivors of future submarine attacks received no help, no assistance, no mercy from U-boat commanders who might otherwise have provided it. Men, women, and children drowned in subsequent years in situations where pre-Laconia policy might have allowed submarines to at least provide lifeboats with food and water. Did Hartenstein's one act of mercy, which saved 1,000 but killed 200 and prevented future mercy that might have saved thousands more, represent a moral victory or a moral catastrophe? The philosophical complexity is staggering. Hartenstein acted according to his conscience and the naval traditions he had been trained in. He saw people who needed help. He had the ability to provide that help. He chose to help, knowing the risks. This is, by most ethical frameworks, admirable behavior. But the consequences of that admirable behavior were death for some of the very people he tried to save, death for his own crew when U-156 was eventually sunk, and a change in German naval policy that prevented future submarine commanders from making similar choices. If Hartenstein could have known, in advance, that his decision to rescue survivors would lead to these outcomes, what would he have chosen? Would he still have surfaced U-156 and begun rescue operations? Or would he have followed protocol, believing that the larger good required hard choices and that mercy, however appealing, was a luxury that submarine commanders could not afford? We cannot know. But we can examine what his actions after the Laconia incident suggest about his internal state. And what they suggest is a man increasingly uncertain whether he had made the right choice, increasingly burdened by the knowledge that his moment of humanity had led to consequences he never intended and could not have foreseen. The psychological term for this is moral injury. It's different from PTSD or battle stress. It's the deep damage to a person's sense of right and wrong that comes from being forced by circumstances to do things that violate their core ethical beliefs, or from discovering that doing what they believed was right led to outcomes that were wrong. Soldiers experience moral injury when they kill civilians by accident. Medical professionals experience it when they must choose which patients to save and which to let die. And submarine commanders experience it when they realize that trying to save people resulted in more death than letting them drown would have caused. Hartenstein's increasingly withdrawn behavior, his loss of confidence, his questioning comments to crew members, these are all consistent with moral injury. He had done what he believed was right. He had risked his vessel and his crew to save people who needed help. And the result was disaster. That knowledge, that burden, is not something that fades with time. It's not something you can rationalize away or forget. Every time Hartenstein gave an order after the Laconia incident, he must have wondered if his judgment could be trusted. Every time he fired torpedoes, he must have thought about the people in the water. Every time he made a tactical decision, the ghost of those 200 dead must have whispered questions about whether his choices would again lead to unintended tragedy. And then, on March 8, 1943, those ghosts finally claimed him. When U-156 was trapped by British destroyers, when the depth charges began falling, when Hartenstein gave the final orders to his crew as their submarine filled with water and sank into darkness, did he think about the Laconia? Did he wonder if this was somehow appropriate, somehow deserved? Did he see the faces of those children in the lifeboat in his final moments? Or did he think, even then, that he had made the right choice? That trying to save people was always better than letting them die, regardless of the consequences? That the world needed people who would risk everything to help others, even if the help sometimes went wrong? We will never know. Werner Hartenstein died without leaving letters, without writing memoirs, without explaining to the world what he thought about his decision in the years after he made it. All we have are the observations of his crew, the official records, the testimony of survivors, and the cold fact of his death at age 36 in a submarine at the bottom of the Atlantic. But perhaps the truest measure of whether his decision was right is not found in calculating outcomes or weighing lives saved against lives lost. Perhaps the measure is simply this: when faced with people who needed help, Werner Hartenstein helped them. When given the choice between following orders that would have been safe and following his conscience which was dangerous, he chose his conscience. He paid for that choice with his peace of mind, his confidence, and ultimately his life. But he made the choice. And in a war where most people never got the opportunity to choose mercy, where most people simply followed orders and did what was expected and survived without ever being tested, Hartenstein at least had the distinction of being tested and making a choice. Whether that choice was right or wrong, whether it saved more people than it killed, whether the consequences justified the intention, these questions can be debated endlessly. But what cannot be debated is that Werner Hartenstein, when confronted with hundreds of people dying in the water, many of them women and children, decided that his duty as a human being outweighed his duty as a submarine commander. And that decision, more than any tonnage sunk or any tactical success or any strategic objective achieved, defined what the last months of his life meant and who he was when he died. The Laconia incident refuses to provide easy answers. Historians, ethicists, and military analysts have examined it for over 80 years, and consensus remains elusive. Was Werner Hartenstein a hero who sacrificed his career and ultimately his life to save enemy civilians? Or was he a commander who made a tactically unsound decision that resulted in unnecessary deaths and damaged the capability of his service to wage war effectively? The answer depends entirely on how we weigh competing values, and different people weigh them differently. From a purely military perspective, Hartenstein's decision was indefensible. He compromised his vessel, revealed his position to the enemy, endangered his crew, and ultimately provided the justification for a policy change that prevented future humanitarian actions by U-boat commanders. A military analyst looking at the Laconia incident sees a clear example of emotion overruling judgment, of humanitarian instinct interfering with operational effectiveness. But from a humanitarian perspective, the judgment reverses. Hartenstein saw people who needed help and provided it. He acted according to the best traditions of naval service, which have always included provisions for protecting those not engaged in combat. He risked his own life and his crew's lives to save others. This is, by most ethical standards, exactly what a moral person should do when confronted with suffering they have the power to alleviate. The tension between these two perspectives cannot be resolved because they start from fundamentally different premises about what matters most. Is operational effectiveness more important than saving individual lives? Is following orders more important than following conscience? Is the abstract goal of winning a war more important than the concrete reality of children drowning in the Atlantic? Your answer to these questions will determine whether you see Hartenstein as hero or fool. And neither answer is objectively wrong. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Laconia incident is what it reveals about the nature of warfare itself. War forces people into situations where the right thing and the smart thing diverge. Where the moral choice and the practical choice point in opposite directions. Where doing what your conscience demands leads to consequences that undermine the very values your conscience was protecting. Hartenstein wanted to save lives. His decision led to deaths. He wanted to show that humanity persisted even in war. His decision led to a policy that formally ended humanitarian gestures in submarine warfare. He wanted to prove that enemy did not have to mean inhuman. His decision provided the justification for treating all future enemies as though they were indeed inhuman. These are not the consequences a malicious person would intend. They are not the results of cruelty or evil. They are simply what happened when one man tried to do the right thing in a situation where the right thing was operationally wrong, where mercy was tactically foolish, where conscience was strategically dangerous. And this is what makes the Laconia incident so profoundly troubling. It suggests that war corrupts not just the evil people who commit atrocities, but also the good people who try to resist those atrocities. It suggests that there are situations where doing right leads to wrong, where mercy causes suffering, where the very act of remaining human in an inhumane situation creates more inhumanity. This is moral injury on a philosophical level. Not just the psychological damage to one submarine commander, but a challenge to our basic assumptions about ethics, duty, and the possibility of maintaining human values during inhuman conflicts. If Werner Hartenstein had been a simple case, either clearly a hero or clearly a fool, the incident would not haunt us as it does. We could file it away under heroic rescues or tactical failures and move on. But he exists in the space between these categories, in the gray area where our neat moral classifications break down. He was a submarine commander who sank ships without warning, killing sailors who had no chance to defend themselves. He was also a man who risked everything to rescue enemy civilians. He followed orders that made him an instrument of war. He violated orders when his conscience demanded it. He was responsible for deaths through his military actions. He was responsible for deaths through his humanitarian actions. And the question that survives him, that haunts his memory, that the Laconia incident forces us to confront, is this: in war, when doing the right thing leads to the wrong outcome, what does right even mean? The survivors of the Laconia, those who were rescued by Hartenstein and then survived the American attack and the French evacuation, carried this question with them for the rest of their lives. Many of them struggled to understand their own feelings about the submarine commander who had torpedoed their ship and then tried to save them. One survivor, a British nurse named Elizabeth McKenna, gave an interview in 1988 about her experience. She described being pulled from the water onto U-156, being given German naval coffee and a blanket, watching German sailors work alongside British soldiers to save drowning children. Then she described being thrown back into the water when the American bomber attacked, watching those same German sailors who had saved her frantically cutting cables to lifeboats so the submarine could dive. "I should hate him," she said of Hartenstein. "He killed hundreds of people when he torpedoed the Laconia. He killed more when he had to dive. But I can't hate him. He tried. He really tried to save us. And he died for it, ultimately. His submarine was sunk. So what should I feel? Gratitude? Anger? sorrow? I've never known. This ambivalence is perhaps the truest response to the Laconia incident. Not certainty that Hartenstein was right or wrong, but recognition that he was caught in a situation where right and wrong became meaningless categories, where every choice led to death, where the best intentions produced the worst outcomes. And if we're honest with ourselves, this ambivalence extends beyond one incident in 1942. The Laconia incident is simply an unusually clear example of a dynamic that exists throughout warfare. Soldiers who kill to protect their comrades. Commanders who sacrifice some units to save others. Pilots who drop bombs on cities to shorten wars. Medics who must choose which wounded to treat and which to let die. All of these situations involve people trying to do the right thing in circumstances where the right thing is unclear, where every option involves death, where moral certainty is a luxury no one can afford. The Laconia incident just makes this dynamic visible in a way that's particularly hard to ignore. Werner Hartenstein's ghost does not haunt us because he made the wrong choice. It haunts us because he made a choice at all, because he tried to insert human values into an inhuman situation, and because the consequences of that attempt remind us how fragile those values are when confronted with the reality of war. The question is not whether we would have made the same choice in his position. The question is whether we could live with ourselves afterward, knowing that our moment of conscience had led to consequences we never intended. Whether we could give orders with confidence, knowing that our judgment had failed before. Whether we could close our eyes at night without seeing the faces of those we had inadvertently killed while trying to save them. These are the questions that haunted Werner Hartenstein for the last 6 months of his life. They are questions without answers, burdens without relief, guilt without clear attribution of blame. And they are questions that anyone who tries to act morally in an immoral situation must eventually confront. Which is why, 80 years later, we still talk about the Laconia incident. Not because it was the largest naval disaster of World War II. Not because it was the most dramatic submarine action. But because it forces us to ask questions about duty, morality, and the cost of conscience that we would much rather avoid. Werner Hartenstein wanted to save lives. He died trying. And the world is left to wonder whether that makes him a hero or a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting conscience override orders in wartime. Perhaps the answer is that he is both, and neither, and that the question itself is the wrong one to ask. Perhaps what matters is not whether his decision was right, but that he had to make it at all. That war forced him into a position where trying to be human led to tragedy. And that tragedy, not the heroism and not the foolishness, but simply the tragedy of being forced to choose between bad options and discovering that even the best choice leads to death, that is what haunts us still. September 12, 2024. 82 years to the day after Werner Hartenstein fired 2 torpedoes at the RMS Laconia. A memorial service is held in a small church in Lorient, France, the port from which WWII departed on its final patrol. The church is attended by an odd collection of people. German naval officers, elderly now, representing the modern German Navy that bears little resemblance to the Kriegsmarine of 1942. British naval veterans, equally elderly, some of whom served in the Atlantic during the war. A handful of families, descendants of WWII crew members who died when the submarine was sunk in March 1943. And in the front row, a woman in her 80s. Her name is Margaret Sullivan. She was 3 years old when the Laconia was torpedoed. She was in the water for 3 days before being rescued by a French warship. She has no memory of being on WWII, though historical records confirm she was one of the children pulled aboard. She has no memory of Werner Hartenstein, though by all accounts he personally supervised the rescue of children from the water. But she is alive because of what he did. And she is here because she believes his decision, whatever its consequences, whatever its costs, deserves to be remembered. The service is simple. Prayers for the dead, on all sides. Recognition that war makes enemies of people who, in other circumstances, would have no reason to hate each other. A reading from naval regulations about the duty to rescue those in peril at sea, regulations that existed before the war and exist still, testimony to humanity's belief that some obligations transcend conflict. And a moment of silence for Werner Hartenstein and the crew of WWII, men who served their nation but who also, in one critical moment, served something larger than nation. Men who made a choice that military analysts still debate, that historians still analyze, that ethicists still argue about. After the service, Margaret Sullivan is interviewed by a local television station doing a retrospective on the Laconia incident. The interviewer asks the obvious question. Your whole family was on the Laconia. Your parents, your older brother. All of you were torpedoed. Many people died. How do you feel about the submarine commander who attacked your ship but then tried to rescue survivors? Sullivan is quiet for a long time. Then she says something that perhaps comes closest to capturing the truth about Werner Hartenstein and his decision. I think he did what seemed right at the moment. I don't know if it was strategically wise. I don't know if it saved more people than it killed. I don't know if a commander should make that kind of decision. But I know he made it. And I know he paid for it with his peace of mind and eventually his life. So I suppose the real question isn't whether he made the right choice. The real question is whether we want to live in a world where people like him can make that choice at all. Where in the middle of war, someone sees suffering and decides to help, regardless of consequences. She pauses, looking out toward the Atlantic, toward waters that hold so many wrecks, so many stories, so many men who died doing their duty or trying to do what was right or simply trying to survive. I'm alive because he made that choice. 200 people died because he made that choice. His own crew died because he made that choice. So was it right? I don't know. But I know that if everyone in that war had simply followed orders and done the smart thing and never risked themselves for people they were supposed to consider enemies, the world would be a colder place. Maybe that's worth something. Maybe that's enough. The interview ends. The memorial service concludes. People leave the church and return to their lives, to a world where the Second World War is history, where submarines are guided by GPS and satellite communications, where the kind of situation Hartenstein faced is less likely because technology has changed the nature of naval warfare. But the questions remain. They remain because they are not really about submarines or torpedoes or one incident in 1942. They are about what we owe to each other as human beings. About whether duty to humanity supersedes duty to nation. About whether conscience should override orders. About what we become when we let practical concerns eliminate moral considerations. Werner Hartenstein has been dead for more than 80 years. His submarine rests somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic, along with the bodies of his crew, slowly dissolving into rust and memories. The Laconia is down there too, along with 1,400 people who drowned when she was torpedoed or died in the chaos that followed. But the decision Hartenstein made on September 12, 1942, when he surfaced U-156 and began pulling survivors from the water, knowing the risks and making the choice anyway, that decision is still alive. It lives in the debates of historians. In the case studies of military academies. In the ethical discussions of philosophers examining the nature of duty and conscience. Most of all, it lives in the question that every person who tries to do the right thing in difficult circumstances must eventually confront: what if doing the right thing leads to the wrong outcome? What if trying to save people results in more death? What if the moment when you choose humanity over orders is the moment when humanity fails most catastrophically? These questions haunted Werner Hartenstein for the last 6 months of his life. They haunt us still, 80 years later, because they have no answers. Only choices. Choices that must be made in moments of crisis, without certainty, without guarantee of good outcomes, with nothing but conscience to guide us. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Laconia incident. Not that Hartenstein was right or wrong, but that he made a choice when a choice was required. That he saw people who needed help and tried to help them, even though trying put his crew at risk and led to consequences he could never have predicted. In the end, when the depth charges fell and U-156 began its final descent into darkness, Werner Hartenstein's last thoughts are unknown. But maybe, just maybe, he thought about those survivors. About the children who lived because he surfaced his submarine. About the men and women who were rescued, who went on to have families, who created lives that would never have existed if he had simply followed orders and sailed away. And maybe, in that final moment, he thought the haunting was worth it. That a life lived by conscience, even when conscience led to tragedy, was better than a life lived purely by orders. That trying to be human in the middle of inhumanity, even when humanity failed, was its own kind of victory. Or maybe he just thought about his crew, his men who trusted him and followed him and died because of decisions he made. Maybe that's what haunted him most, not the enemies he tried to save, but the friends he couldn't. We'll never know. The Atlantic keeps its secrets. The submarines rest in darkness. The dead are silent. But the question lives on. And it lives on because it's not really about Werner Hartenstein or the Laconia or U-156 or September 1942. It's about all of us. About what we do when the right thing and the smart thing diverge. About whether we follow our conscience or our orders. About what we're willing to sacrifice to remain human in situations designed to make us inhuman. Werner Hartenstein made his choice. It haunted him. But not making that choice might have haunted him more.